Our challenge is to learn how by faith to put it into practice. The truth is, because God is almighty, God's ability to provide for us anything and everything that we require to follow him and to obey whatever he asks of us is there. Even if God has to provide miraculously for us, as that's what it takes, then that's what God will do so that we can follow him. Just like he did for the children of Israel in the Exodus. Manna from heaven every morning, 6 days a week for 40 straight years, each and every week. Each and every one of those 6 days. When we get to our Old Testament reading today in Exodus chapters 3 and then to 4, what we have read, Moses has been out in the wilderness. In some perspective, you could say he's been hiding out for 40 years. So you remember the account of Moses. He was raised up in Pharaoh's house. Remember, the Lord delivered him in the basket, raised by Pharaoh's daughter, was a leader of the Egyptians, but he killed another Egyptian who was beaten up, one of the other Hebrews, and he fled and he hid out in the wilderness. Well, 40 years into hiding, God comes to him and speaks to him in a burning bush. And God says to Moses, I've seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I've heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering, so I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now go, Moses. I'm sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people up out of Egypt. And as God called Moses into his service, Moses gave his initial response as a litany of excuses of why he wasn't the guy. Who am I that I should go? I don't think that was necessarily a false sense of pride. It was, I'm a murderer. I blew it. I thought I went in my own strength and I failed miserably. God, I don't want to make a mistake. I don't want to be a failure for you. No, who am I that you should pick me to go? When that excuse didn't hold water, then Moses says, well, God, they're not going to believe me that you sent me, that you've actually appeared to me and talked to me, and that I'm supposed to be here on your behalf and under your authority to take them home. When that excuse doesn't hold water, he says, God, I'm not an eloquent speaker. We might say, well, I'm not used to speaking in public out loud in front of large groups of people. When that excuse doesn't hold water, then Moses finally says what's really on his heart. I don't want to go. You send somebody else. As God has this conversation with Moses, and Moses begins to respond, what God asked of Moses must have been impossible in his eyes to accomplish. I'm not who you need. You've made a mistake in picking me. What if we were to stand in Moses' shoes? And instead of God calling Moses into service, he's calling you and me into service. He does, you know. If God is inviting us to join him in his mission to save the world, and God says, I've got a specific opportunity for you, just for you, to go, what would we say to God? As we listen to this conversation between God and Moses, where it's specifically and particularly when Moses says, what if they don't believe me or listen to me what I have to say, and say to me, the Lord didn't appear to you? What am I supposed to do? And God said, what's in your hand? He said, a staff. He said, throw the staff down. And it turned into a serpent. Now again, this is not the first snake Moses ever saw. But this snake apparently was so ferocious he ran. either out of surprise or fear, we don't know. And God says, pick up your staff again by the tail. And he does. And it returns back to a staff. An ordinary hunk of stick. It could have been his staff for 40 years. It could be an old, tired, worn-looking stick. It didn't matter to God. With Moses' staff, God worked in some mighty ways when Moses was willing to put his staff in and loosen his grip and put it into God's hands. Think of some of the things that Moses did. Of course, when he went before Pharaoh, and God said, and through Moses, God says, let my people go. Pharaoh says, well, what can you do? And he had his magicians turn sticks into snakes, and Moses threw his staff down, and his serpent ate up all the other snakes. And it turned back. With Moses' staff, he not only did that, but when they were coming up out of Egypt, and remember their backs are up against the wall by the Red Sea, and the Egyptian army is pursuing them to enslave them once again, Moses raises his staff, and God parts the waters of the Red Sea, and they cross over on dry land. Not too many days into the wilderness, they're out of water. God turns bitter waters sweet. He brings them to an oasis, and at one point in time, when they're out of water, God tells Moses to take his staff and strike a rock. And out comes, pouring out of that rock, millions of gallons of water to quench the thirst. And even in Acts 17, as the Amalekites are fighting against the Israelites in the Exodus, Moses went up on a hill. As long as the staff was raised, the Israelites prevailed. When he got tired and his arms felt heavy and it drooped, then the Amalekites prevailed. So they sent up two guys. One guy's name is Hur, H-U-R, and it's the only place in the whole Bible he's ever mentioned. He with another held up the arms of Moses. But here's this ordinary old stick that Moses was willing to loosen his grip and put it and place it into God's service, and God involved a silly, stupid stick to do some great and mighty wonders. How many of you think you're worth more to God than a stupid stick? Yeah, a stick comes in handy on treacherous ground, keep you steady and so on, but I think we're worth more than a stick. What's important to note is as long as that Moses held it in his grip, it was just his staff. But when he released it into God's use, it became, as he began to refer to it, as the staff of God. So let me ask you this. The question that God asked Moses, what's in your hand? Who are you? What experiences have you had? What wisdom have you gained? What special gifts and knowledge and abilities do you possess? What resources has God entrusted into your care? God asked the same question. What's in your hand? Before we answer, there's nothing I can do to make a difference for God and his kingdom and the salvation of other people. Many years ago, when I first went into the ministry back in Osceola, Iowa, our last full year there before we came here to be your pastor, Carol and I were talking about how to increase what we could release for God's use and service. And I came up with this idea of using our garden. Let me tell you, this garden was solid clay. I put in 2 tons of sand and rototilled it in there, and it still was one big mass of clay. Growing anything was tough. But in the last week of March, when Hannah was just about Daphne's age, I took a stick and poked a hole in there, and she would take the seed and drop it in there. And we said, Lord, at the beginning, if you'll show us how to use this garden, we promise a tithe of this garden we'll use for you, if you'll just show us how to use it. That summer was a great drought in southern Iowa. Farmers were losing their crops. This garden dedicated to God's service stayed green. And even if it had been a good year, the harvest that came out of that garden would be remarkable and astounding. And about the time that the harvest was beginning to come in, the cucumbers were ripening, the squash was going, the spaghetti squash was coming in, all of that, the green bean. There's this lady with a couple of small kids. Her husband decided he didn't want to be a dad or a husband anymore, and his wife had been out grocery shopping with the kids, and when she came back with the kids, the door locks had been changed, and all their belongings were out on the front yard. This young mother was trying to remake her life and start over again from scratch after that kind of a desertion and abandonment. And I said, maybe this is God's answer. And I said to her when I went to visit her after the first time she'd ever been in church in her life, and she said, and I asked her, could you use a few things out of our garden? Here's what we've got growing. She says, oh yes, anything that you would have, we would greatly appreciate. Because what we've got on welfare is not much. And most of that's going into the rent. I said, great, I'll be by. You know, by the time that garden was done, we had given that mother and her family about 90% of the garden, and Carol and I still didn't know what to do with the 10% we had so much. Several years ago, right here at Holy Cross, a young mom with 2 young children was praying. She said, Lord, I don't think I have much to offer, but I used to be a regional manager for Weight Watchers. I care about the health and well-being of people. If you'll show me a way how you could use what I know, I would be gladly put it into your service. And she discovered online a Bible study that helped you people learn about healthy practices for your physical life and your spiritual life. And she started a couple of small groups, some of them which lasted 7 years. What's in your hand? What has God already put there in terms of ability and know-how and resources? In the midst of God's call of Moses to be his deliverer, it's a question that God asked Moses. God said, throw your staff down, the staff that's already in your hand, so that people believe that the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, has sent you. If God can use a stupid old stick for his glory, he can certainly use you and me. Don't you think? We might not understand or know how yet. Or maybe the word is now or in the future. But he can use us if we're willing to release our grip and to place it into his hands. I want you to know, just before Christmas, as our ministry team and elders and their spouses gathered at our house, I handed out a book called by Henry and Richard Blackaby called Flickering Lamps. It's a book that those that serve by leading here at Holy Cross are going to be working through over the coming year with me. And in that book, Henry and his son Richard, who was very small back then, he had left a thriving, large congregation that God had used him to grow in Texas. And he answered a call to a church in Saskatchewan. It only had 12 members. And they were hanging on for dear life, and they asked God to send someone that would help them so that their church could grow again. Just 12 people. And they are just one bill from closing. And this is what Henry and Richard write in the book. He says, our church had to answer the same question God asked Moses. What's in your hand? What resources has God given us personally and corporately as a congregation that if we surrendered to him, he could use powerfully? When things are declining, our natural tendency is to tighten our grip on our few remaining resources so that we don't lose them too. But the only way God will use what we have in a mighty way is when we trust him enough to loosen our grip. They went on to write, our church discovered that there were many more divine resources in our midst than we first realized. We had perhaps the most unimpressive church building in our entire city, but it sat empty most of the week. We decided to release our grip on the facility and place it on God's altar. Soon all manner of ministries began taking place in it. And they quickly discovered that one of God's greatest provisions that was already in their hand as a congregation was the people God had already planted there. The key lesson that we need to learn from Moses here in Exodus 4 is this. It's not what we don't have. It's not what we're not. It is who we are, what we do have in our hand. That God simply says, offer it to me in my service. I'll show you how to use it. And I'll use it in some amazing ways. So the people that we live in the midst of, that are around us, young and old alike, can know my son and believe in him in the forgiveness of their sins by faith, gain heaven with us. God is faithful and good. He loves us absolutely unconditionally, and he's inviting us to come and join him in what he's doing in and around us. So I want to encourage you to begin to do what Moses learned to do. Release your grip. Instead, be willing to invest who and whatever you are for God and his purposes. I tell you this, as a circuit visitor, I'm in my 4th term in the years I've served you as pastor, which means that I have the opportunity to work with other congregations in our circuit, especially when they are without a pastor, and help them to get a new pastor. And I'll tell you, one of the things that are most common at a time like that is that people believe if we just get the right pastor or the right DCE or the right staff person, whatever the job description is, if we just get the right person who will work hard for us and for God, then God's work will be done among us. But you know, the churches that are successful, and I define success by those accomplishing Christ's mission, the ones that understand that God sends pastors and other church workers to disciple and train and equip and release us and help us to begin to discern how we can offer to God who and what we are and what's in our hand. Those are congregations where many of the people of that congregation are saying, here I am, Lord. If you'll show me, I'll serve you. If you show me how and what and where and when and why. Let me leave you with this one verse. This comes from Isaiah 43, verses 18 to 20. Do not remember the past events. Pay no attention to things of old. I'm about to do something new. Even now, it is coming. Do you not see it? Indeed, I will make a way in the wilderness, even rivers in the desert. And each of us can be part of that. In Jesus' name, amen.